Welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Andrew Ziegler.
And I'm your host, Ben Lloyd Pearson.
This week, I'm sitting down with Amit Patel, Director of Software Development for Kiro at AWS, and we dive into how his team, operating like a startup inside of Amazon, created a new agentic IDE called Kiro that uses spec-based development to create persistent structured plans. This approach keeps context alive between sessions and your teammates and fills in a crucial part of the agentic handoff. Amit shares how his team used the tool to build itself, and all by creating the space for engineers to do their best work. Who would have known? But before we dive into it, in this week's news, we're covering a few topics, including something that came across our desk about AI being in its dial-up era, engineering managers who are paralyzed by fear and how they act out, a hack that someone did for their Wi-Fi connected robot vacuum that was just too good to read. And have you been pwned? The record 2 billion exposed emails that just hit the latest database. A lot of them new. So we're going to cover all of this stuff. And Ben, I think let's start at the top. Shall we do that?
Yeah. So I wanted to cover this story on AI's dial-up era. So this comes from Substack user Nowfall. And look, Andrew, it's 1995 all over again. You know, the AI boom feels like the early internet, like full of hype, destined for a bunch of shakeups. But while all the while along, we're building these foundations for what the future is going to look like.
Yep.
And, so back in 1995, like let's all think back 30 years. The internet had just started to go mainstream. Many of us were just starting to get connected to it and imagining the possibilities that it would bring to us. And, looking back 30 years on, in a way, both the optimists and the pessimists were right about many things over the years. But ultimately, it was incredibly hard to imagine what life would have looked like here in 2025 if you were sitting there back in 1995 just getting connected to the internet. Like let's just think about the fact that like the internet search or the internet giants now started as a search engine and an online bookstore. Would you have imagined that those would be the titans 30 years later?
Truly.
Yeah. And this article brought up, everyone's favorite philosophical concept in 2025. That's Jevons paradox. But it approached it in a way that I think is nuanced, in a way that not a lot of people have covered this paradox, and that is that, more supply, yes, it can lead to more demand. Like if you build more efficient steam engines, you may just increase demand for steam engines, but there's a limit to that actually. And many industries, they grow in demand for a while, but then productivity and demand for that service or that object reach some sort of equilibrium that sort of causes employment to drop over the long term. And, we're all like navigating this space of AI with its excessive hype, its inflated valuations, these inevitable failures that are certainly around the corner. But there's a lot of infrastructure that's being built in this space right now that will outlive a lot of that hype and bubble popping. I feel often that we're kind of at like the peak of it right now, especially with like what we're hearing around like OpenAI coming out, and they've got 1.4 trillion in spending obligations over the next few years, and off revenue of like less than 2 billion revenue per month. Do the math on how long it's going to take them to pay for for that without extreme growth. And I've seen a lot of these parallels sort of between the internet bubble popping and how it gave us all of this internet or inexpensive infrastructure that was then used by all the Web 2.0 companies to sort of build the next generation of the web. And this article really just sort of makes the point that we can predict change, but it's really challenging to know the specifics of that change.
Yeah.
Very few in 1995 foresaw dating apps or Uber or influencers being a career option. And similarly, AI is going to unlock a lot of new domains and job categories yet that we just don't really have a concept of yet because they haven't been invented. And a great example was how there's a lot of job transformation that happens during these sorts of changes. Journalism as a function has expanded over the internet era, but the journalist job has declined all along the way. Just as a great example, like I would say you and I, Andrew, we are certainly not journalists, but we do engage in a lot of acts of journalism, as do many professionals in our space. Um,
Yes.
but I wanted to cover this because this is one of the best articles that I have read in quite a while about the state of the AI industry, and it really closely matches, my own perception on where everything stands. And I just love the closing line. Our AI future is loading. Like we're all still determining that today. So,
Yes. I love how it ended. Ben, you phrased that all so well. This article for me was also really amazing to read, really poignant of a time when transformation was happening really rapidly. And none of us could have really predicted how it was going to shake out to be the world that we live in today. Like you said, it ultimately called us this transformation of so many things that we took for granted or just thought were going to be around forever, both in good and bad ways, right? And so ultimately, it's about understanding where that change is taking you now and really living in the moment. Because I think the people who got the most out of all of that transformation and change were the ones that were looking not at what could be in the far, far potential ahead, all of the hypotheticals, but looking at what's possible right now. Like you hit on how journalism is something that became more approachable for everybody. That's because the freedom of dissemination of information over the internet became so powerful and it became so easy for everyone to share their perspectives, their experiences in real time. And on top of that, it really brought everybody into the world of journalism. Helps everybody think like a journalist. And the same thing right now is happening in engineering. We're inviting the
exactly.
entire world into how the engineering world works with AI, because AI is making it something that anybody who can conquer language, which everybody can use and can do. So we're in this like powerful new era where our roles and jobs are transforming, but we're going to see a lot of things of people playing with these new parts that they never had exposure to before. And that's where bloggers and influencers come from. Like, I'm really excited to see what the people of the world do with their accessibility to technology.
Yeah, and one great point that this article makes is that software engineering as a function could, or as a role, as a job, could be plateauing, either today or in the near future. But software engineering as a function or as a capability is probably just going to continue to increase in demand. It may just not be the role anymore. It may only be like a part of a role.
That's right. That's right. So moving into the work environment, yeah, let's jump from the work environment and how, or rather, let's jump from the environment that we live in and how it's rapidly evolving into the real life work environments that we live in now and how they're populated by people, and we have to navigate people problems sometimes. And this really amazing article by Stefan Moreau came across our desk as well, and it's about a study from work life that's looked at how workplace environments from managers can create psychologically unsafe environments. We're talking about managers who control power with fear and who act out because of their own insecurities. And these kinds of behaviors, they cause an estimated 36 billion in lost productivity worldwide. I think, many of us have been in toxic work scenarios before. I touch on this because this article in particular frames it in the engineering manager world. If you've ever been in that kind of environment in a technical one, where there's also maybe, some bad people chemistry going on in terms of a manager who doesn't feel secure in their role, or they are lashing out for other reasons. Ultimately, we're all human, and unfortunately, sometimes we get the worst of humans as well. But Ben, you want to walk us through some of the ways that Stefan framed how this fear really operates, and how our listeners could really recognize it and navigate it.
Yeah, and so I really like how Stefan framed this through two different lenses. So there's almost like an internal focused fear where you exist in an environment like you described where it's psychologically unsafe, and this can lead to like a vicious loop of things like micromanagement that just destroy trust. There's also a version of fear that's almost more external focused. It's fear that keeps you aware of competitive pressures, technical debt, the ability to optimize for excellence. And the latter type of fear is completely normal for humans or for any life form, really, for that matter, to engage in because it's a healthy way of just promoting continuous improvement, responding to external stimuli, things like that. But there's a lot of great tips in this article. First and foremost, psychological safety is the top predictor of team effectiveness. Everyone
Yes.
on your team should feel free to voice their concerns. That it should be an environment of being able to share opinions in a trusted space. You also should understand the things that you fear to analyze whether they're actually worth fearing or not. I personally always think about worst case scenarios for practically every project I engage in. And it's not to be afraid of them or to get fixated on them, but it's to understand the level of risk that I'm taking on. And usually the worst case isn't so bad, and I'm willing to live with whatever that level of risk is. But that's a perfectly healthy response to fear. And then if you do feel like you're in an environment where you are maybe stuck in a fear-based leadership loop, just pick one to work on. Whether that's a communication challenge, micromanagement, decision paralysis, conflict avoidance. Like there's a lot of ways you can break down your fears into to like determine which one might be causing the most disruption.
Literally telling you to pick a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's some great quotes at the end of this too. Like I love fear mediocrity more than mistakes, fear stagnation more than experimentation. There are healthy things to fear. Just use them to channel yourself in productive and positive ways.
Here's the deal. We all end up in these scenarios from time to time. I myself have been in a toxic workplace. And the first step is acknowledging it and understanding it for yourself. And then, like this said, carving out that safety for yourself. Picking a struggle, as comical as it might sound on the surface, is actually the best thing you could probably do for your psyche, as well as evaluating the things that you are worried about and have fears about. Like, is it worth worrying about, even in the worst case scenario? Literally walk it all the way through to the end. Is it really that bad? A lot of times it's not. So don't make your own boogeyman as well. And if you're in these kinds of situations, we wish you the best in navigating it. And we hope that this article can help you do so.
All right, now let's move on to fear of IoT. So we have a really interesting story about vacuum robots. Andrew, what is this?
Okay, I love this one because I'm always really skeptical about the Internet of Things. I'm not that person who has like all of their stuff on their router. I do have a few smart devices around my house, including though a smart vacuum, against my own wishes. It's unfortunately just something that other people in the household really want to have, so it lives with us.
Hey, now I love my smart vacuum. So
I do not. Me and my smart vacuum, we have an understanding. But ultimately, this story is about how invasive these things can really be in your home. And it hits at how the technology inside one of these particular vacuums works, including transmitting telemetry information about it going around your house and mapping out your home. So you have to send that stuff off to a third-party server to get processed. Of course, there's not enough processing power on the robot vacuum. But there's a lot of other security concerns in there as well, transmitting really sensitive information about your house, but then also being connected to your local network through systems that may not be very secure. This was an article by Joey Morales about how he really got into a war with his vacuum, disabling it, changing how it worked, and ultimately it was issued a kill command by the remote manufacturer. And he was
wow.
actually able to, or they were actually able to revive it, opening it up, connecting it with Python, and creating some custom scripts with custom hardware to actually get it to run again. This was a really fun article about how you can take the Internet of Things back into your own hands. And I myself really felt justified about all my hatred for robot vacuums by reading this one. What did you think, Ben?
Well, first of all, I mean, it really lends credence to the narrative of how bad centering your life around services that have to exist on the internet for like core functionality. Like if a manufacturer can just turn off your vacuum robot because you disabled a setting on it, like that's very anti-consumer practices, unfortunately. But I mean, I love the ingenuity. Software engineers are certainly the types of people that will figure this stuff out and make it work no matter what. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of it's just a great journey on like understanding this vacuum and following the journey of this person. There's some great advice on not using your primary Wi-Fi network for IoT devices and sort of treating
Yeah.
them as strangers in your home. So I did say I do love my robot vacuum, but it also is not allowed to go on the internet. uh, and I have actually had a lot of smart devices in my home in the past, but they are always on their own separated network with a lot of restrictions around how they can access the internet, and many of them are just refused access. And I'm also a big fan of if you are doing IoT stuff, the more that you can control within the confines of your house. So using local protocols and control devices, the better, because then you kind of cut out the need for these
Exactly.
internet services. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
I'm
great
like,
story. So go read it if you just want to learn how to fight off these anti-consumer practices with engineering.
and just take this hardware back into your own hands. I think it's getting easier than ever to really poke at these devices. We've covered this in a few different stories now recently of people taking everyday pieces of hardware like a receipt printer or an actual printer or in this case a vacuum cleaner and changing it to modify for how they want it to work. I think hardware modifications really expanding right now because you can use LLMs to do a lot of probing information about how the technology works and actually get that architecture up and going. But I'm over here right now staring at my vacuum cleaner like, yeah, I'm talking about you. And it's sitting over there looking back at me. So before it starts moving, I think we should just move on to the next episode or to the next story here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I wanted to cover this one. So, Have I Been Pwned out with a really great article written by Troy Hunt. 2 billion email addresses were exposed, and the Have I Been Pwned team had to go through the arduous effort of indexing all of these. So I'm a huge fan of this organization. If you're not aware, they're an organization that keeps track of all the passwords and email combinations that have been published to the internet by malicious actors. This data dump, the most recent one that was covered in this article, is 3 times the size of their previous record. So 2 billion emails, 1.3 billion passwords, and about 625 million of which were unique. So just an
Wow.
extraordinary amount of data. It brings the total accounts that are on the website to just over 17 billion, about 17.2 billion.
Wow.
And this article has a lot of really interesting technical details about the challenges they faced while handling this data. The mere act of hashing the email addresses was enough to just like crash their infrastructure. So they ended up having to build this fairly complex process of batching things in chunks of 1 million records. And then on top of that, they had to notify 2.9 million subscribers by email whether that their account was in this dump. So just a great PSA. Make sure to check your accounts if you haven't already. It's a good practice to check this regularly. Really fascinating story. What do you think,
Yeah.
Andrew?
This one was really interesting. The size of this breach is huge, y'all. I know it's easy to kind of roll your eyes. You're like, oh, another data breach story. That's kind of how I initially kind of glanced at it too. But 625 million unique passwords in this dump is really significant, and it's worth going in and punching in your info to see how it works. And speaking of how it works, you go to the website and counterintuitively, it asks for your password that you want to test. Which is really fascinating to me as an engineering challenge because like Ben said, they had to go through all of the batching to ingest all of this and to actually do stuff with it. But then they have to manage and actually let you check against this data in a really safe way. So the engineering architectural challenges of making Have I Been Pwned possible are magnificent. And the service that they offer to, the entire world is really impactful because you have to think about this in downstream consequences. If Have I Been Pwned didn't exist and people couldn't verify, then people's accounts would further get compromised, which would then cause more things that get into the breach, which would ultimately cause a lot of internet security problems around the globe. So by having this kind of step in place, it kind of stops the bleeding. It's like a tourniquet, right, on these password breaches. And it lets people kind of get a control on what they could do with it. And working with this huge amount of sensitive data that in most cases is hashed, you can't even see it. Can't verify what's going on underneath. It actually reminds me when we had Min on the show recently from Transcend talking about the engineering challenges of working with highly private data that you can't see, the security practices behind working on that kind of scale of really sensitive data. It's a huge challenge, and it's something that her and her engineering team it carries itself as a first class concern within their engineering org. So same thing is happening here. This is a highly secure engineering process to make this possible. Really fascinating to me, and kudos to the Troy Hunt and the whole team there for continuing to operate the service for everybody.
Yeah, and if you haven't listened to that episode that Andrew just mentioned, make sure you go back and check it out.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one.
Yeah, so speaking of guests, who do we have this week, Andrew?
Yeah, so like I mentioned at the top, after the break, I'm sitting down with Amit. Amit is from AWS, and he's talking all about Kiro, so you don't want to miss this one. Stick around. My guest today, for those listening, is Amit Patel. He's the director of software development for Kiro at AWS. And today we're diving into the new agentic IDE his team built called Kiro. And picture this, it's a tiny team inside of Amazon that starts from scratch. In under a year, they build a vibrant community with hundreds of developers testing nightly builds. They use the tool to build the tool itself, and they even start contributing code back to a foundational AWS service, S3. And what made all of that possible? Well, it's a new approach called spec-driven development. And today we're learning what it takes to reinvent the agentic coding experience. Amit, welcome to Dev Interrupted.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Great. Well, we're really excited to dive into this with you. I'm a Kiro user, and I have so much success I've had with the tool. So I'm really excited to learn more about where it came from. And I think that going back to my tool adoption this year, I found that early AI coding tools, they were great at quick wins, but it struggled on a team level to get code across the finish line to production. And it became a real pain to build complex stuff that was shared across lots of workspaces with project specific details that live outside of the chat window itself. I think it's what we've all learned this year. So Hero at the top addressed this with a structured spec-driven flow that bakes in all of that context. So what signals did you see that showed you that prompting isn't enough for building real-world software that led you to creating Kiro?
Yeah, when we started out with Kiro, it's probably more close to a year ago now. One of the things that we were looking at was what are the problems that developers are able to solve with AI as it was at that time, and what are the things that they struggle to solve? And we talked to a lot of developers inside the company. Obviously, we have a very active internal development infrastructure and community. And we talked to a lot of those developers. We talked to a lot of customers as to what they love about using AI in the development lifecycle, what kind of frustrations they were hitting, and what they would like to see improved. And at the time, the industry was also improving things. For example, introducing things like steering and rules and other ways to guide the LLM to do what they needed it to do. So as the industry as a whole recognized that there are limitations to what can be done in a simple chat window with just vibe coding, especially when the problem to be solved is a reasonable size problem, a meaningful problem. It becomes quite difficult to have enough context and enough memory as an individual developer to remember what you did yesterday or 2 days ago,
Right.
and what you told the agent. Even 3 hours ago, sometimes I forget what I told the agent to do, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do was to solve that problem in a more structured way, and not simply provide, snippets of memory or some kind of steering, or, we have those things in Kiro and those things are important, but we didn't feel it was enough to just kind of provide those things. We felt that in order to build more complex projects, in order to tackle harder problems, which required multi-day initiative, we needed more structure. So that's the sort of genesis of the product idea.
And how does Kiro keep that context alive between days and teammates? Because I completely agree with you about that ephemeral nature that happens in the chat. Maybe you don't remember what happened 3 hours ago. So how does Kiro transform that ephemeralness into something that lasts?
The concept we introduce is what we're calling spec-driven development. And rather than remembering what the prompts were 3 days ago, what we're saying is Kiro will allow you to essentially build a plan, a structure for your project or whatever work you want to do. And it has 3 stages. So first stage is, and again, this is typical of any software development project, which is, hey, let's define what the requirements are. That's the first step. Then let's define what the design is going to be for those requirements. And then let's figure out how we're going to implement it in a step-by-step way, and make sure that at every step we have made progress towards the ultimate goal, and that we are not, introducing issues or regressions or whatever else, right? So those are the three stages of what we're calling spec-driven development. And what we've built into the tool is the ability for people to plan complex things and then to have a very structured task list. And the task list that comes out of it is really the way that the user of Kiro, the developer, can keep context on what was done. I completed tasks 1 to 5 yesterday. Now I'm going to go on to task 6 and 7 and 8. Kiro actually can look at all the tasks that were completed in a previous session and say, okay, these things are done. Kiro can also see what the requirements are. Kiro can also see what the design is. And so all of that context is available on task 6 and 7 and 8 and 20 as you go down that list. So that's how it maintains the knowledge of what it has done, what it's supposed to do, and what the ultimate goal is.
Yeah. And I want to call out the great part about Kiro 2 and how it captures that spec is, this becomes like a really a first class experience inside of the IDE in a way that maybe is new to some developers. The spec driven development in some cases will really push you back into doing the designing, planning, making sure you have a really clear structure because of how critical it is for it to work. And so what other guardrails does Kiro have built in besides keeping the user on this structured flow? Are there other things that usually get baked into a spec that make it more robust out of the box? How does it help the engineering leaders trust the end result that comes out of the IDE?
During the sort of requirements and design phases of the spec, the developer can actually ask for additional tasks to be done. By default, we're also, in our structured approach, we're also doing things like enabling the Kiro to generate unit tests for the application or the feature that the developer is trying to build. But as a developer, you can just ask Kiro to implement either architectural changes, like, if you wanted to go in and say, hey, for these requirements, I want you to, have this kind of scaling potential so that, the application will be built for a scalability or whatever those requirements are. You can add those to the requirements, or you can add them to the design, whether if they're functional, non-functional, and so on. And that will then generate the tasks that are necessary to accomplish those objectives. So there's a lot of things that Kiro does in itself in terms of things like unit tests and so on. There's a lot of things that developers can do in the early planning phases to make sure that their functional and non-functional requirements are going to be met by the ultimate output from Kiro.
Yeah. And what do you think people should really care about when evaluating these AI tools and these new IDEs? Like, should a leader prioritize about what matters to their team with these tools?
There are a number of things that we would a leader should consider. One of them, obviously, is what is the priority for their organization. Typically, those things revolve around having their engineers be more productive, and that the output from these tools is actually maintainable and it is production ready, and also that the developer ergonomics are there so that their engineers will enjoy using these tools. Because if the tool is good but it isn't enjoyable to use, or it causes a little paper cuts or frictions, it can be really frustrating and reduce productivity. So ultimately, this is about having productivity increases in your organization and making sure that the output from these tools is something that is maintainable and reliable and operationally excellent, so that it doesn't cause a lot of issues after you've shipped it to production.
Right. Cogen's just one part of the process. Does it cause issues downstream? I also love that you called it the developer ergonomics, like that experience, that joy of creating software with the tool. And, to get there, you told me that you went through 6 iterations of the spec experience to make it as good as it is now, and to meet the developers where they need to be met right now. So what did that journey feel like? Did it feel like overkill doing 6 iterations, or did it feel like exactly right in the amount of iterations to get where you got?
Yeah, I mean, I think our approach was to make sure that we had something that would be useful and easy to use and deliver the productivity that developers wanted. And we didn't know at the beginning of the journey whether it would take us 1 rev or 6 revs. We just didn't know. We just wanted to make sure it was right.
Right.
What we found as we kind of went through this, because we kind of worked with a lot of internal developers to make sure that, we validated our assumptions about what would work and what wouldn't work. What we found is that people had ideas on how we could improve things. And every time we felt that those ideas would meaningfully improve things for our customers, we went back to the drawing board and we tried to incorporate those. It did take us 6 attempts to get there. I think it was worth the journey because what we ended up with, actually, I don't think we could have got in one shot. I mean, it really required that number of iterations to get to where we landed.
Yeah, I think it speaks also to the exploration phase that everyone is in. Nothing's more exploratory than the actual, agentic coding experience that you'd be working with
Right.
in that unknown. And so, along the way, as you create this experience for devs, I want to go back to like software and how that could translate it into specs itself, because building softwares can be a highly opinionated and prescriptive thing for different orgs, and they have their different requirements and different things that they care about that matter to them when making software. So how does AWS evaluate spec quality and evaluate how that actually impacts the needs of the users? How customizable is this? How much does it prevent people from hurting itself? I guess the question becomes, how opinionated is it and how easy it is for people to change for their own needs?
Yeah. So one of the things we wanted to do was to balance the ability of developers to change things as in how they need it with the ability for the LLM to actually understand the spec when it came out at the end of the process, right? So, and because the LLM is by nature non-deterministic, the less ambiguity you give it, the better the output will be, right?
Yep.
So we chose to use EARS format. It's sort of, I won't go deep into that, but people can look it up. We used EARS format so that it provided some structure, then enabled the developer to either use the normal chat window to iterate on the design and the requirements, or if they wanted to, they could go directly into the markdown files for requirements and design and edit those directly, and then ask the LLM to generate the task list based on their edits. So that provides enough flexibility for people who either directly want to edit the markdown files or who want to use the LLM to make the changes that they wanted to make. But we have set it up in a way that you can iterate with the design and with the requirements as much as you want, and then based on those requirements, generate the design, based on that design, generate the task list, and then execute the task list that ultimately comes out. So it was super important to make sure that, we enabled that level of kind of iteration. A lot of times, people will just one shot the prompt and say, hey, I want an app that does X. They'll generate, that will generate a whole bunch of requirements. You can then clarify it and say, hey, no, I don't want a web app. I want to build it using Python or whatever. I don't know. And that's how you iterate with the requirements. So a lot of the times people just go with the one shot and generate the requirements, generate the design, generate the task list. And then after it's built the first version of the feature or the first version of the app, then they go and say, okay, now I want to refine it. Now I want to do something else. So you can choose to do it in either way. But that control is with the developer.
And since that control is the superpower, the taste that the developer brings and how they use these tools, it's also the new kind of skill set and the new layer in which engineers operate on. They're decision managers in this world. And do you think we're heading towards a world where maybe we have spec reviews as much as we have code reviews, where since so much of this work and thought that developers do now moves so early and so critically foundational to any software project, that almost reviewing and getting on the same page about that is more important than what happens downstream, or maybe equally important?
I think that it's actually better to clarify that we haven't tried to significantly disrupt the typical software development lifecycle, right? So we have requirements, we have design, and we have a task list. Those are the three different stages of the spec. So even before AI, teams would regularly do design reviews. So they would have a design doc and they would review the design doc and they would go through that, right?
Yeah.
With the tools that we have now with the spec-driven development, you can still do that. You can still generate the design. It's a markdown file. You can even print it and have a meeting and talk about the design that was generated by the tool, or you can collaborate in front of a screen and just edit the design together. So I think it doesn't take away the normal software development best practices. If you have a project that you're working on, it's meaningful. You've generated requirements, you've generated designs for it. I would expect that design to be reviewed with the team and iterated and worked on.
Yeah, no, you make a great call out here, and it's actually one shared by many great minds at some amazing companies like your own that we've been speaking with around how large companies are using, these new coding tools, and all of them equally and rightfully call out, just like you yourself just did, that, ultimately it comes down to having best practices. It's a force multiplier for what your organization is already doing. And if you have these great rituals and processes and support that allows your developers to ship great software already, then you're going to have a lot of success bringing AI into that world. If you don't have those practices, you're going to find it rapidly misunderstanding and misdirecting you. So I think that's totally right to clarify and call out, and kind of like a great part of what makes the tool so flexible too, is it meets people where it needs to be.
And typically, on a reasonably complex project, it would take an engineer maybe 2, 3, 4 days to write a design doc for it.
Yeah.
The benefit of something like Kiro is that you get the design doc in 10, 15 minutes, and then you can just go and have that meeting and have that review. So
Yeah.
that's the benefit, right? It's not circumventing some of your regular processes, just getting you there quicker.
So going back to like the genesis of Kiro, you tell the story like Kiro has been launched as a startup inside of Amazon. What did you do differently? How did your team operate that was maybe different from a quote normal AWS team that gave you that startup level speed?
Yeah, I mean, first thing to say is that a lot of the AWS portfolio of products started off in a very similar way. That kind of gets together and says, "Okay, I have an idea for a product, and let's go and build it." So, in that respect, we didn't do anything different, and we had this product idea, and we were asked to go and build it. And this idea of small teams moving fast and being able to implement things based on customer needs has been part of the Amazon culture since even before I joined. So, I think that part of it was the same. The things that were different for us is that we were building client software versus what most of AWS does, which is to build cloud services. So that piece of it was different. We had to innovate and invent a bunch of different things, everything from how are we going to distribute this software to what build system should we use, because we can't use the internal build systems. We actually build this externally in a GitHub repo and things like that. So there were a lot of different kind of things that we had to invent in order to just be able to kind of move quickly. But also we also wanted to make sure that we did iterative development on this. So we didn't kind of wait until we had a completely working product before we kind of did some beta testing. We
Yeah.
actually onboarded and worked with a number of our colleagues in the company who were willing to be guinea pigs for the early stages of development and really help us to define. And I talked earlier about the spec-driven development and how we iterated on that multiple times in the early stages of the product.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't have been possible without leveraging the broader community of engineers inside the company.
So that feedback loop, like these nightly build groups, these canary testers, that's what really moved the needle and let you kind of move quickly. How did you operationalize on that and filter any kind of noise from like gold that you then acted on?
With that, we were pretty sort of frugal in our approach to this. We just sort of set up a Slack channel, invited about 50 or 100 people, and said, "Okay, guys, we'll give you a nightly build. You'll be able to update it automatically, and then what we'd like you to do is just to dump all of your thoughts into this Slack channel, and then everyone in the team would go through the Slack channel every day and filter out all the important things we wanted to work on,
Yeah.
and make sure that we iterated on it, and the cycle kind of went on and on every day after that.
I love that. So it's like you're getting to tap in all these different feedback layers. And another layer that you talked about tapping into are folks like solution architects using Kiro to build and deliver things. What kind of things did they teach you about the real world usage that maybe that internal engineering feedback wouldn't have surfaced for you?
Yeah, so we, as we progressed through the development lifecycle towards the later part of it, where we had actually a reasonably working product. Obviously, it had bugs and things in it, and those needed to be resolved. We actually expanded that initial group of 50 or 100 people. We expanded it to include not just engineers, but people in our solution architect team, in our sales organization, people who are working with customers, and ask them to see how this would help them in their day-to-day jobs. So instead of just helping us to debug the product, they were actually using it for their day-to-day jobs and saying, okay, well, here's where it was useful for my day-to-day job, and here's where it wasn't so useful. And that also then helped us to understand, do we actually need to build a feature for that? Or is that shortcoming okay for the audience that we're targeting? And we went through that process in terms of trying to figure out, are we building the right thing for the right audience? We couldn't build everything for everyone, obviously, but we wanted to make sure that for the audience that we were targeting, we were not missing any edge cases on how the product could be used.
And along the way with that, did any other power user stories that maybe seemed unlikely at first pop up or emerge as these different kinds of groups did get their hands on the tools for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of internal usage for what I would call large scale production projects. I think at the beginning of this, you mentioned the S3 project.
Yeah.
That was super interesting. One of our very senior engineers in the company was part of this early group of adopters looking at the Kiro product. And they were using it for their day-to-day job, which was to build large-scale components for S3s. And they would come back and tell us all the things that worked and all the things that didn't work, and we iterated, we improved. But ultimately, they were able to build meaningful pieces of a new product launch that was part of the S3 service. So we've had multiple examples of that inside the company, where people have built some meaningful things for their for different services in the company.
And when it finally reaches this point where even the engineers that are building Kiro are using Kiro to build
Yeah.
Kiro, what was that moment like? What did that unlock, like culturally, just generally, for like what it meant to get to that point?
It actually happened pretty organically. So I mentioned the Slack channel earlier on, where we just get people, saying things. One of the testers at the time said, "Hey, you know what? When Kiro is doing a task using the specs, it can take 5 or 10 minutes to execute. I don't want to keep watching it do its work. I want to go and do something else. So is it possible for Kiro to tell me when it's kind of finished, right? Finished the task."
Oh yeah, the
The
notification.
notification thing. Yeah, the notification thing, right? So we looked at it and we said, yeah, that's a lot of work. We have multiple platforms. It'll probably take us about 3 or 4 weeks of engineering work to do it. And one of the engineers on the team one afternoon had an hour or two, I don't know why, but had some time. So they plugged the requirement into Kiro and said, hey, what would it take to build this notification system? And it generated the spec for it. It did all of the platform specific things like, hey, you have to do this on Windows and this on Linux and this on Mac. It did the whole thing, and we were able to build that whole feature in about 2 days, and it worked. And that was the kind of realization that, yeah, you know what, actually you can just add features and build things on Kiro without actually having to handcraft everything yourself.
And do you have any kind of advice for other leaders at companies that maybe want to emulate the same kind of layered feedback approach and virtuous cycle, this virtuous feedback that you managed to tap into to build something so quickly with such high impact?
I think that one of the things that we noticed was that it doesn't just happen because you've got the mechanisms in place. you actually need to have the space for the engineers on the team to react to those mechanisms, right? So we didn't cram the engineers' days with task after task after task. We actually allowed them to be on Slack, engage with the customers, or well, they were internal users, but we call them customers, and get their inputs and have discussions with them, walk through how they were using it. Having the ability for your engineering team to do that and not just work on feature after feature, having the space and time to do that is super important. And those engineers enjoying that process is also super important, because that's where the real benefit comes from, is to get that input in real time.
It's such an amazing call out, because I think it's all too common for places to start with the impulse of creating the mechanism to send in the feedback, to otherwise start the loop, right? But without necessarily giving the developers the same amount of space to stop and to listen and to pay attention to what they're building. And that's how you actually unlock the loop of that feedback. And as you've called out, you can't just have those mechanisms in place. And were there any other surprising things about Kiro along its journey that has really made it stand out for you, maybe against like other projects at AWS that you've worked on before?
One of the differences, and I've personally worked on a number of different service launches and developer tools over the years. One of the things that we got right in this product, which I think was really one of the important success factors, was that we decided not to limit ourselves to what historically AWS has done. I'll give you a quick example. Typically, whenever services are built in AWS, they're built around an AWS account. So if you want to use one of our services, you need an AWS account. One of the things we realized early on was that, yes, we could do that with Kiro as well. But if we did that, it would require our customers to, first of all, create an AWS account if they didn't have one. So we made a decision early on to allow people who had Gmail accounts to use our product. Now, that may seem like a small thing, but actually it was one of the larger, more meaningful decisions early on in the product. And I think if we hadn't have made that decision in the right way, we would not have had as much of a success, because people would have been reluctant to create an AWS account just to try it out.
And because of that decision too, do you think Kiro is positioned to maybe appeal to an audience that maybe traditionally hasn't been a developer or an AWS engineer?
When we look at AWS overall, things like S3, DynamoDB, EC2, there's a certain audience that wants to use all of those things, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at developer tools more broadly, there is an overlap between developers who want to use EC2 and S3 and DynamoDB, but there's also, in that Venn diagram, there's also a bunch of developers who just want to build a website or something like that, right? So we wanted to cater to both of those audiences to make sure that, people who just want to build a website for whatever purpose, and people who want to use EC2 and DynamoDB and S3, they are all able to use Kiro and all get the benefits of using Kiro. And that was a kind of important decision we wanted to make at the beginning. And for those people who want to use a website or want to build non-cloud applications, forcing them to create an AWS account or any cloud account seems like an overhead that they probably wouldn't be interested in doing. But they're all developers. So we wanted to just make sure that all developers could use it.
Right. They're all developers. I love that realization and how profound that actually was for AWS as an organization to make that decision and act on it. And I do think that speaks to the future of what development looks like, and engineering being more accessible to more people. And I can see all sorts of technologists and knowledge workers leveraging the success of Kiro. Like you said at an earlier point in our call, you could come in with that one prompt, make me this app, and just see where it goes. And it's great at making the in-between, conquering the spec and then actually making the plan and then executing on it bit by bit. For those that have a lot more intention, you can pack that all in too, and then use it to create something really specific and meaningful for you. So I think that's an exciting reflection on the tool itself and how robust it is and will continue to be. And I've had a lot of fun really digging into this with you, Amit. It's been a really fun conversation. And I appreciate you taking us on this journey about what this new coding experience is going to look like. And before we wrap up, where can our audience go to learn more about your work, but also to go experience Kiro since it is accessible to all?
Yeah. So to learn more, just Kiro.dev. We also have a channel on Discord for people to provide feedback. So if you just want to hear what other developers are saying, you can go to our Discord channel. Again, you can find that on the website. So
Yeah.
uh, look forward to people trying it and giving us feedback and making it better.
Amazing. Well, we're going to include all of those notes, including some
Yeah.
supporting stuff for the things we discussed. And, if you listen to this and if you're a Kiro user or if you end up
Mm.
trying Kiro after this, I'd love to hear from you. I know Amit would as well. So let us know your feedback. Raise your hand, come find us on socials and continue the conversation on LinkedIn or in the comment sections below, wherever you're listening to or reading this. But thanks for joining us. That's it for this week's Dev Interrupted. We'll see you next time. And Amit, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks. It was great talking with you.